did they feel bad that they were sending these slaves into a tortured, horrific life working in sugarcane factories in the Caribbean, or they didn't know about it?
Well, they didn't know where they were going, but though I suspect they didn't care, because the slaves were always, they were never selling their own people. They were selling their enemies. They were never selling their own people. They were selling their enemies. Africa, from early on, had always had a series of kingdoms, and sometimes, small kingdoms become large kingdoms, and they do that by conquering their neighbors. Prior to the arrival of the Diligent, there was this tiny little kingdom of Ouida.
Let's go to Princeton University, and I just want to use this map real quick, 1710, right? Right? You guys are familiar with Negro land. You guys are familiar with this, but I want to highlight a certain area here. We see the slave coast here. We see Ouida, right, which is Judah.
This area was called Kingdom of Judah. Well, maybe they just called it that, like a nickname or something. But actual Hebrews didn't live there. Well, let's take a look. This is from Press and Bulletin's magazine. Language doc from the Society of Geography. Wahida, also called Fida, Huida, Uida, Judah or Judah, is an ancient city frequented since the 16th century by Portuguese slave traders who gave it its name. Its inhabitants were said were Judaic and were viewed as the remnant of the scattered tribes of Israel.
Africa and Its Inhabitants, Volume 2 by Ulysses Reclus, Ouida or Wida. And notice what it says on the next page or the next bullet. The old writers called it Judah. Let me say that again. The old writers called it Judah.
And the kingdom of Ouida was a tiny little kingdom. I mean, it was like 20 miles of coastline and 20 miles inland. That was it. But yet, in the first quarter of the 1700s, about 46% of all slaves coming out of Africa were coming from that one spot. Now, why? The answer is the kings of Ouida did not send out armies and capture slaves. They just controlled the ports. And kings of Ouida, all they did is tax the trade and take a percentage of it. And so they were getting rich, even though they didn't have much of an army and they didn't attack anybody, and they were just happened to be in the good spot for profiting from the trade. And then the king of Dahomey, who was farther inland and was cut off from the coast by the kingdom of Ouida, destroyed them so he would have access to the coast. And then he used his access to then develop his army and expand his kingdom. So you had the merchant kingdom being destroyed and replaced by the militarized kingdom, if you put it that way. Obviously, there had been kingdoms before that had armies, and I mean, there's a long history of various kingdoms in Africa. But the new thing here was that they could get ready supplies of guns from the Europeans. And in 1732, and the kingdom of Dahomey had been a relatively small kingdom, but over the previous 10 years, it had been fighting a series of wars and expanding and expanding. And it continued to expand until about 1750. And the prisoners of those wars then were often sold to the Europeans, usually in exchange for guns and gunpowder. Because King Agaja of Dahomey had started out with an army that used bows and arrows, and he quickly replaced it with an army that used nothing but guns. And certainly, the Diligent arrives on the coast of what was then called the Kingdom of Dahomey. The ships would be filled with with goods that Africans wanted to buy, a lot of cloth, metal goods, other things. And then these goods would be taken to Africa and traded usually for war prisoners, because various African kingdoms were often at war with one another.
But I also want to draw your attention to the writing on this particular map. Here, I am credibly informed that a country about 100 leagues north of the coast of Guinea is inhabited by white men, or at least, she says, and then she says by white men, but then it says, or at least a different kind of people from the blacks, right? Inhabited by white men, but then again, a different kind of people from the blacks who wear clothes and have a use of letters, make silk and have some of them, that some of them keep the Christian Shabbat. For me, it's like, wait a minute. How is it a shock when you see this word white men wearing clothes and have use of language, letters, writing skills? So I had to think about that. And then to see Christian Shabbat, that's a whole nother thing that we could talk about as well. Caucasians, right? The Catholic Church, the Christian Church, at this time, they viewed our people, the Negroes, or whatever, they viewed all the different tribes within Africa as being uncivilized.
Negro land was more civilized than a lot of people give us credit for, amen? Than cities, having running water, sewer system. You got to understand, listen, man, these are the people of the Most High. If you want to look for, God, an example of Wakanda, Black Panther, advanced civilized society, that's Israel in the days, God, of our diaspora. And so you got the Hebrews. We could read, we could write. You got Josephus, a general, writing the histories and the antiquities of our people. Listen, what's going to happen when you got an educated, advanced, civilized people that begin to make money? They begin to capitalize, God, on the void that's there. And the Europeans are expanding. Watch this. The Europeans are expanding, and they need a people.
Well, in the early 1400s, around 1445, Prince Henry the Navigator, in Portugal, was sending out ships to explore the coast of Africa, and he wanted them to bring back things to pay their way. He wanted them to bring back gold, but they weren't having much luck finding gold. So he said, well, bring back something so that, we're not wasting our money sending you out. So the early ships would attack, especially small islands where there would be Africans living, by fishing mostly, and they weren't expecting to be attacked, and they'd be attacked and grabbed and hauled to Portugal. And they weren't expecting to be attacked, and they'd be attacked and grabbed and hauled to Portugal. These ships coming were hostile, and they got ready to defend themselves. And the Portuguese started getting defeated a lot. And some Portuguese crews would be destroyed, and the Africans were defending themselves very well. So then the king sent somebody down to spend a year visiting all the local African kings and chiefs and convincing them to engage in trade and not in warfare. And so that was the beginning of what was the pattern then for the next 400 years, that slave ships would go to Africa and they would purchase slaves. They wouldn't try to go into the African continent and conduct raids because, well, they were vastly outnumbered. The Africans knew the terrain, they didn't. And plus the crews of most ships, these were sailors, these were not US Marines, they were not SEAL Team 6. They didn't really know how to launch a raid on a village anyway. So most people learned about slavery in US history courses in high school. And so most people think that the slave trade was all about people taken from Africa and brought to the United States. And while that was terribly important in the history of the United States, the fact is that of all the slaves who were carried across the Atlantic during the 400 years between 1450 and 1850, only about 4% of them came to the United States. The rest of them went to the Caribbean and South America, mainly Brazil.